And a little while ago, a guy called Steve, who's here this afternoon, and I conceived the idea of a sort of TV show based on the whole business of wanting to get published, as so many people do. And we made a TV pilot. And we were looking for a top agent to give her advice and criticism in a robust
But she couldn't do it, so she got
So yeah, so eventually we got Carole. So we asked Carole to do it, and this event is sort of inspired by the fun we had making the pilot, and we're still in talks with various commissioning editors and TV channels. So it might be on a screen near you someday. In the meantime, you can see the whole of it on YouTube. But just to give you a flavour of what started this event, I'm just going to play you just a minute and a half.
It can also apply to be on it.
Oh yes, and you can also apply to be on it as well if you go on our Wannabe blog. But I'll tell you about that later, and Morgan's going to press
Would you have it from one point of view throughout the whole of a chapter then, or would you?
No, a scene. You can move from one scene to another within chapters, but you've got this opening meeting between the two of them,
right.
The parents of Lola, not even Lola, and you switch backwards and forwards. You see Kevin's point of view of Sandra, and then you see Sandra's point of view of Kevin.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Not sure that you do, but
told you she's getting a bit stern now.
I do see what you mean, but it's sort of how I suppose it's just because.
Do you read much fiction? If you want to be a published writer, you have to read.
Yeah, I do read.
Because then what you need to do, you need to read and analyse it. You need to think, why is this author successful? Why is this novel? Why is this novel keeping my attention? Why am I still turning the pages?
Yeah.
You have to step back and think, oh, okay, so we're seeing all this from the woman's point of view. It's not until the next chapter we get the man's view version.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I think once you start analysing it, you'll see what I mean more clearly.
You know, because I'd just done that short bit, I didn't really know what to do after that, and because this is the first bit of writing I've ever written that's not, well, that maybe be for someone else and not just for me, if you see what I mean. I didn't really know what I was doing.
That to cheer myself up. A miserable Monday morning, and I put that on just to give myself a smile. Thanks, Jen. Anyway, the way this event is going to work, for those of you who don't know, we've had lots of people apply to take part this afternoon. We've chosen a lucky 5. And we're going to have to whiz through it all quite quickly because I know that everybody will have questions for Carole afterwards, so we are going to go at a pace. But basically I'm going to read the first paragraph of these 5 entries, and Carole is going to give us her wisdom on them. And then afterwards there'll be questions from the audience, okay? If you're interested in reading the whole 1,000 words that was submitted, I'm not going to read all of that obviously because it would take up all the time, and there are other events on in here afterwards. We will be asking those shortlisted writers if they would be prepared for us to put it up on the Wannabe a Writer TV show blog. And if they agree, then we'll pop them up there. So you will be able to go on there. And you can watch the whole of the film if you'd like. She makes that face a few more times.
I've tried not to since I've seen this.
Terribly entertaining. Anyway, I shall begin by just asking Carole, in a nutshell, to tell us, obviously you've got a lot of big clients, you deal with big books that sell in their millions. And over the years you've got very adept, haven't you, at knowing quickly whether something's going to be for you or not.
Yeah, I think the general point I want to make is that every writer I know finds it difficult to write a synopsis. I have a lot of sympathy for that. But those of us in the profession who are deciding whether to take something on or not, whether we're agents or publishers, need a synopsis because you can't always commit to reading 75,000, 100,000, 150,000 words before you know, in order to make your mind up. So we do need a synopsis. But I don't read it first. I read the chapters first to find out whether someone can write. You read the synopsis afterwards to see what kind of story they think they're writing. So don't obsess about it too much. Most agents have lots of information on their websites about submission procedures. That's just a recommendation. If you're completely and utterly brilliant, if you are a genius, you can break all the rules, but be very, very sure that you're a genius before you break all the rules. One thing to say about the synopses I read for this competition is that most of them were not synopses. Most of them, despite the fact that the general instructions said, write a synopsis, bracket, including the ending bracket, which is a clue that it needs to, what am I looking for, meant to include the ending. Quite a few of the synopses were blurbs, were the kind of cliff-hanging descriptions that you'd read and enjoy at the back of a paperback. But for a professional, I need to know the ending. Because if I'm not told the ending, it's not always easy to work out whether this novel is a tragedy or a comedy or a farce or a thriller. So those of you that just thought, and then she found out, ... No, but I didn't. You've got to tell me. Several of them started off with prologues, and I think most of us in the business agree that you've got to be very, very good if you're going to make a prologue work at the beginning, because that gives you a little taster of something which isn't the moment where the plot starts. You know, you have that, perhaps something that happens near the ending, and then you go back and you start the novel. If you're going to do that, make sure that you can really grip your reader before you do. And the thing that I have an absolute bête noire about, if you're writing a plot, particularly a thriller, and one of your crucial plot points is a coincidence, I'm not going to read any further. That's all my general cheerful points. Right, shall we array?
Okay, I'll stand up to read this, just so it's a little clearer. Our first contestant, as it were, is Eve Carpenter-Smith from Witney in Oxfordshire. Where's Eve? Are you here? Eve's at the front. She's smiling at the moment. Eve writes and works as a business consultant, juggling 2 young children and a husband. The title of her novel is Green Gold, and it's an eco-thriller. Now, we asked everybody if they could make us an elevator pitch. I won't spend hours explaining what that is, but basically it's the sort of description of your novel that you could quickly tell somebody in the time it takes for an elevator to go up. So should you be lucky enough to meet the head of Hodder or HarperCollins in the lift, or the book buyer from Tesco's, you're ready with a really quick, pithy description of your book before they get out on the 6th floor. Okay, they're going to run a mile when you say you've written a book anyway. So here we go. Her elevator pitch is: Green Gold is a thriller about a scientist called Max who invents something that will change the course of history, but some people prefer the status quo and are extractors. Welcome to the nerve centre of our operation, the inner sanctum, said James in mock hushed tones as he hit the buttons on the keypad. The light flashed green. There was a beep, then a click. James held the door open and they filed into the lab. Max hung at the back like a naughty schoolboy, shuffling in behind an immaculately dressed man in his 50s. The guy's suit looked as if it had just been made. Perfectly fitted, no creases in sight. Had to be worth 2 months' salary, at least. Probably some tailor on Savile Row. Wasn't that where people like him went? Max had no idea. He glanced at his crumpled department store trousers poking out beneath a dirty white lab coat. Something the colour of blood was smeared across the pocket in front of his groin. Possibly ketchup. Could have been there for days. He sighed, as if such things mattered. So, Carole.
Right, one more general comment. I have read a lot more than the piece that Jane read out, but I still haven't read as much as I would want to read if I was going to make a judgment to take somebody on. So these are snapshots. I'm going to be very quick about it so we can get through all of them. I like the title. I like the fact that it's an echo thriller. I like the fact that your biography tells me you know what you're doing in this area. That's all. That would get me involved to start with. I think that in that piece that Jane read out, our central character is Max, but the very first time we meet him, you belittle him by saying he looks like a kind of nervous schoolboy or something. There are a couple more points where you actually belittle him too, and I think you can't do that. We don't necessarily need a shining, sparkling hero character, but we've got to admire him. Given that he is a scientist who's invented something that could be literally life-changing and earth-changing, we need to admire him rather than think he's a bit of a twerp. So I think you need to think about the characterisation there. There was a coincidence in the plot. The memory chip his daughter Ellen finds, and I'm thinking, that was lucky. So when it comes to the writing of the plot, you've got to make sure that we really believe that, because otherwise there's going to be an exasperated, that was too easy for the plot. The synopsis is a blur because you haven't told me the ending, but I'm still intrigued by it. It's good, it's really good. And yet later on you've got somebody mouth and arms rotating like an exercise bike. I couldn't actually picture that at all. And I would say, because he's got this tragedy in his life, he's a widower, you need to bring more of his emotional life up front so that we are invested in him as a man as well as in him as a scientist. But it's some good work there.
Lovely.
I don't mean that to sound as patronising as it can.
You didn't sound patronising, you're the expert. The thing about coincidences, people will say, oh, but it did happen. I did go all the way to Vienna and met my next door neighbour. And, unfortunately, truth is stranger than fiction. You can get away with it in real life, but if you put it in a book, the editor tells you to lie in a darkened room. Okay, our next person is Mike Kilbane from Chipping Norton. Where's Mike? Okay. So, after a successful career as a journalist in newspapers, radio and television, Mike has switched from fact to fiction. The title of his novel is Who's Watching? It's a crime thriller, and the elevator pitch is Who's Watching is about a serial killer who targets the woman who presents the weather on his local television channel. That's a good elevator pitch, because a good elevator pitch is it's about somebody who does something, and that's a nice, simple, good one. Right, so here we go. Here in his shed, Geoffrey Gridley felt safe from prying eyes. He'd been on the road, working around the country, labouring or fruit picking, never staying long in one place. But over the last few months, he hadn't been able to find work so easily, and had been spending more time at home. As a result, he'd been able to build the shed up from the ruin it was. He came across it when he was out walking in the fields at the back of his mother's house, on a small patch of scrubland adjacent to the garden wall, overgrown with tall grass, brambles, weeds and nettles. It was originally an old stone cattle store, and the tiles on the roof were held together by tough, stringy tentacles of wild ivy.
I had forgotten until Jane said you were a reporter, that you had been a reporter, and several days ago when I read this, I wrote on the end of it, a lot too much reportage, not enough drama. I'm trying to excuse myself by saying I've forgotten that. But I think that piece that Jane read out and the way it goes on after that, it's a bit linear. It's a bit and then, and then, and then. Because this is a very creepy sounding novel of stalkering taken to, that's probably not a word, is it? Stalking taken to a horrible degree. I think you'd be better off by starting right away by showing us creepy Geoffrey painting his mother's toenails, which really gives me the creeps, watching the woman on TV that he's going to stalk, because then we know what's at stake right from the very beginning. There's not enough of him on here. There's a lot of what he is doing, one step after another. You need to bring the emotion and his awful mindset right up front, because the novel synopsis is edgy and it makes me feel uncomfortable, which is great because this kind of novel should. Particularly that bit about him painting his mother's toenails, which really I don't want to think about too far. But there is also a coincidence in your plot. I've got the line, Narina's and Geoffrey's path accidentally crossed. No, it can't. It would in real life, but you're not going to be able to make me believe that unless you work at it very hard. I'm still going to have that coincidence bell going off in my brain. So I really do think, change your beginning. Make it clear that you're not the outsider watching these events, but you are the narrator telling us about it. And you want us, the reader, to be inside the head of this creepy man, because that would then be extremely uncomfortable.
Okay. Jo's career has encompassed many roles, from cleaning and bar work to setting up a training centre in Paris for Xerox. Jo is presently the director of the Broadstairs Food Festival, which I can recommend if anybody would like a little weekend by the sea. The title of the novel is One Too Many Secrets. It's life writing as a genre, and the elevator pitch is a little bit of a long one actually. Helen Rutherford, the alcoholic matriarch of the family, is dying. Now reunited, the siblings are forced to come to terms with the impending loss of their mother and past conflicts. A truth is revealed that has serious and surprising consequences for the family. If you are going to do an elevator pitch, you'll have jumped out by then and run a mile, so try and get that down to a couple of sentences. Okay, the beginning of the novel. They gave me a bath. Was that yesterday? Soaked between my legs. I cried. I didn't want my knickers removed. People touching me. My arms were slipped into cotton sleeves that stopped short of my elbows. Someone called me dear. Come along, dear. Patted me dry. I smelt fresh cotton. Made me think of ironing. Had I been ironing? I used to like to iron. Sheets, pillowcases, smoothing the creases to a polished sheen. I hear footsteps, always footsteps, walking up and down, never a moment's peace. I want to go home. When can I go home? There's a haze of a girl somewhere over there, across the room. Young girl in a smock dress, a strand of damp seaweed crushed in her hand. Salt, I can smell salt. Sea, taste salt, metal in my mouth. Water, can I have some water? I need some water. Somebody? My voice creaks, cracked and dry.
Again, that's a prologue, but it's a good one. It really makes me want to know who this woman is. I would make it really short and tight, because you want to get to some of the answers and you want to find out who your main characters are. Really, although everything pivots around this woman, your main characters are the siblings who are fighting with each other and perhaps fighting with her. I had a question about the fact that you called it, that you said the genre was life writing. It's not, it's a novel. Life writing is memoir. And the synopsis ends with the sentence, the revelation has serious and surprising consequences for the family. And I just wrote, what, with 3 exclamation marks and question mark. You've got to tell us what the solution is. But, and also, of course, I've read so little of it, and I've only read the first person prologue, which I do think is a bit too long. We need the voices of those other siblings to come in. I think you can afford to make that prologue 2 paragraphs, because the writing is edgy and uncomfortable and intriguing, but then we want to find out what's at stake, what's going on. It's not just a memoir of this woman who's dying.
Lovely, thank you. I'm very sorry, I went out of order.
Yes, you did, but I'm hoping, Jo. I'm not going to get you forever.
Yes, I'm having a bit of a day with bits of paper today. I keep losing them, I get them in the wrong order. Our next entrant is Michelle Barber from Barrow-on-Humber. Are you there, Michelle? Oh, you're there. Okay, Michelle, thank you. Right, Michelle earns a living content writing and has had children's stories and articles published in the People's Friend magazine. She has a BA Honours in Literature and an MA in Creative Writing. The title of her novel is How to Get a Husband While Solving a Murder. It's cosy detective, and her elevator pitch is Victorian Harriet Twine must choose a fiancé who looks like an ill rabbit or murder and Dante disguise. And here's her extract. If Harriet Twine ever looked back on what had happened to her, she would have to say that the chain of events which set it all rolling started off in the most mundane of fashions. For Harriet was simply going into her father's study to borrow his newspaper to find out if anything exciting had been happening in the world outside Beaver Stream. As Harriet's hand rested on the knob, she heard the shrill sound of the one person in the world whose name could send shivers down Harriet's back. Gracious Stoker. Harriet Twine bent down and peeped through the keyhole because she was sure that she was mistaken.
You rightly describe this as a cosy detective, And I hadn't looked at that line first, I was reading the chapter first, and I wrote in the margin, is the farce intentional? Now clearly it is, and I have to state right now that's not my chosen area of reading or representing, so I was sort of looking at it from the outside, but I like the humour both in your autobiography and in some of the plot. I think it's lightly and well done. There is a huge coincidence there, which is that our central character longs to be an artefact recorder in Egypt. Next paragraph, she's on a station and the trunk flies open and she sees an Egyptian mummy, you know, as we all do. So I think that coincidence somehow, in the writing of it, you've got to make us believe that that could be likely, because otherwise it's just too easy a get out for you in your plot. It does, because of the genre, and maybe because I don't know much about the genre and don't work with it, it feels a little bit dated to me. I mean, I don't know whether you intended it to feel like a period piece. I don't just mean the fact that it is set in the past, but I'm not sure that it would be easy to sell right now.
Yeah, I've actually had somebody, not an agent who said it to me, but somebody who is a published author who said they actually really loved. They read more than you did, and it reminded them of Matt and Lucia and stuff, but they didn't think...
Well, then that's great, because obviously somebody knows the genre more than I do and has some constructive things to say about it.
Yeah.
Okay. And our fifth and final extract is coming from Tony Tippenham from Lowestoft in Suffolk. Over down there. And Tony has been writing steadily since 2011. You can find him most days lurking at a keyboard, either in his day job in IT, writing his latest project, or involved in amateur dramatics. The title of the novel is Trixie's Promise, and it's a romance. And the elevator pitch is a daughter's conflict between honouring a promise to her father and her growing love for a talented boat builder. A love triangle between a man, a woman, and a boat. Here is the extract. Trixie looked down towards the old boat shed, her thoughts raging behind cool green eyes. Cheeky sod. She almost spat the words in frustration. Her first instinct had been to chuck the interloper off her father's estate, but then, as Aragon shifted restlessly beneath her, caution took over. She wouldn't risk her stallion's legs down the steep, overgrown track to the bank. Calming herself, she steadied Aragon with practised ease. The horse's impatient shuffles and fidgets masked by the sound of woodworking below. The wild undergrowth hid her from view, and so she watched. He didn't act furtively. The boat shed padlock was open. Had her father given the sod permission to be there? That's Trixie's Promise. What do you think?
I thought it was a bit soap opera-ish. I thought the plot was a bit too soft. If you would want to get this onto a list other than purely genre romance, it would have to be a bit higher concept, I think. I knew right from the beginning that our sexy Charlie was going to end up with Foxy Trixie. I mean, there's no way that that wasn't going to happen. So when it did happen, it was a bit anticlimactic because it was signalled from so very early on. It's good to signal things if we are kept on the edge of our seat with some degree of tension about it, but this seemed an inevitability. And for somebody who will never go on water unless I've got a gun at my head, it was a bit too much about yachts. I wasn't surprised to see that you knew a lot about them, because by the time I'd read these few pages, I felt I knew quite a lot about them. But I think that the writing will have to be really, really top-notch to pull this off, because I think you need a little bit more drama in the plot and a little bit less melodrama. Because it is a bit melodramatic in places. I mean, why does she immediately think that this stunningly sexy bloke shouldn't be there? I mean, my first thought was, well, whoa, you know, bring it on. But, so I think you need to take down the melodrama and inject a bit more oomph into the plot.
Okay, lovely. I would like to thank everybody who did enter. I know some of you in the audience also put in extracts. And I'd also like to make it clear that we didn't just strictly sort of pick the 5 best. We looked for a variety
Just
of
insulting everybody now.
No, we're not.
interrupting you for a second, it's very, very brave of anybody to be prepared to be critiqued in public.
Yes, a round of applause for those. I really, really enjoyed them all. I thought, you know, it's great. You know, very brave, great, good feedback. I'm sure you'd all love to ask Carole questions, so we will open it up to everybody in the room now. Who's got the first one? Yes.
Just have a question, quick one, is how, in reading the submissions, how representative were they of what you read on a daily basis as an agent?
What comes into us is far wider than could be represented by these 5. Despite the fact that our website, which has a huge amount of information on it, including about what each agent represents and what each agent doesn't represent, I say quite clearly I don't represent children's books because I know nothing about children or children's books, and quite frankly that makes me very happy. But I still don't say children's books. So the first thing that I think when somebody sends me a children's book or a First World War history book, these people haven't taken 1 second to do any research about my agency. Now I will tell you something which is funny, but it really did happen yesterday morning. I looked at my emails as soon as I got there. First of all, astonishment that I could get emails, because last time nothing reached me, even phone calls, while I was here. And there was a submission. My email address is carole@blakefriedman. So there's a reasonable hint there that my name might be Carole. And the submission opened up with, "To whom it may concern." That is really, really stupid. I mean, there's so much, I know I'm veering off of your question, but there is so much information available on publisher and agency websites. We've got masses of articles that we've written, you know, interviews, all kinds of stuff. There's no excuse for not picking the agent in the agency you want to send material. So we do all share it within the agency, but we've taken a lot of authors from the horribly named slush pile, I didn't make that up, but through to stuff which is beyond amateur, and you just think this is even a waste of an email. But the range is so big, both in genres and types and quality.
That's reminding me, was it last year or the first year of the Chipping Literary Festival when Carole did an event on a panel? I introduced the panel. I said, Agent Carole Blake. She then answered questions for an hour. The lady then walked up to the table, got a copy of your book, came back to get it signed and said to me, "What's her name?"
It's on the front of
the programme. I'd said it 100 times. Yes.
At least to say thank you.
She got a short shrift, didn't she?
I mean, that's funny, but you know, there's no easier or faster way to annoy an agent, and actually you want the agent on your side when you're making a submission, than to make a really obvious mistake that shows that, kind of like a headline, "I haven't looked at your website because I can't be bothered." And you know, there's so much more information available now than there used to be. Always look at what's on the website, yeah. Unless that book was newer, which it should be, because I'm 6 years overdue.
Congratulations, it's a brilliant book.
Oh, you're very
it
kind.
has
Write this woman's name down, she's my new best friend.
The world changes so fast. I mean, I wrote Wannabe a Writer in 2007, so that's 10 years after yours. But I put 1 page of ebooks in there, and I asked somebody else to supply that, to write it, because I knew nothing about ebooks. And they were just, you know, now, you wouldn't dream of writing any sort of how-to book. But mine's still full of lots of interesting information. It is actually, I can attest to that. Okay, by the way, would somebody mind telling me what the time is? Because
it's just
they haven't put a clock in it. Oh, okay, so we're doing good. We're doing good. Okay, another question.
Hi, I'd like to ask a question about query letters. It's maybe related to the gentleman's question before. I've been to a few classes like, you know, the Guardian master classes, and there's websites and things like that, but I find that the advice in terms of content and structure, it tends to vary.
Of course it does. There's a joke in publishing that if you put 6 editors in one room, you'll get 7 opinions. You know, those of us in publishing tend to be opinionated, perhaps. So there will be different ways of doing it. You know, don't worry about it too much. And
I think that's probably my question, is
yeah.
actually...
Well, first of all, if you're going to submit to me, look at my website. Look at what we ask for. But again, if you do something slightly different, I'm not going to turn it down just because you haven't followed the rules I said, you know, because if the writing's good, I want to read it anyway. But you mentioned a query letter. I would say, don't send me a query saying, can I send you a submission? Send me the submission. It saves all of that time. I don't want to have to answer another email before I get the submission.
Would you find, because that's oftentimes what they ask for on the website, would you find that if the query letter perhaps didn't follow a structure, would you still read the first 3 chapters?
But I read the chapters first.
You actually do just open the chapters?
Because if you are a good writer, I want to find that out as fast as possible. If you're not a good writer, I don't care what you're writing about, so the synopsis is irrelevant.
Okay, thank you.
It might be interesting at this point to give some facts and figures. Tell the audience perhaps how many submissions Blake Friedman gets.
Well, it's actually quite hard to work that out now. When they all used to come in envelopes, God help us, you could add up how many came in the post in the morning. Like many other agencies, we now say on the website, we really don't want piles of paper, only submit my email. We still get at least 20 to 30 a day by paper, which is an immediate kind of hint that those people haven't looked at the website. But because we say on the website, please submit to whichever agent you think is most appropriate for you, they come into all of our inboxes. Now, I get perhaps, it ranges, it varies very much. I get between 2 and 25 a day. Many more on Saturdays and Sundays, many more on Christmas. Even on Christmas Day, you think that person doesn't like their family. So we don't spend time saying to everybody, how many did you get today? But it must be more than we used to get by paper, because there's no cost involved except, bruised ego. There's no cost involved in sending an email submission. So that there are many, many more. What I tend to do when they come in, I can't deal with them during the office day. I park them all in a special folder, and I will spend Saturday or Sunday afternoons every second weekend doing them. I do sometimes have a bit of an event on Twitter if it all gets a bit too much. I never identify anybody, but if there are particularly stupid questions or lines, I will sometimes quote them just to get it out of my system. They go off and kick a filing cabinet.
I had a letter into Writing Magazine a month or 2 ago from somebody, saying that they'd sent this submission to an agent, and the agent had told them what was wrong with it, and they didn't quite understand what she meant, so they'd written again asking for more explanation, and hadn't had a reply. And I did sort of tell them off really and say, you've got to remember, that agents are inundated with submissions, and also are actually there to make money and to deal with their, they have a business to run, and they're there to deal with their published clients.
I mean, we
have
have to read the material by our clients before we can possibly read the material by people who aren't yet our clients. I mean, a very close friend of mine, I was having a bit of a vent to Fanny Blake about this at lunchtime, very close friend of mine who is a professional in another area of the arts, sent a manuscript in to me recently, and 4 days later said, I haven't heard from you yet. And I said, no, because it's London Book Fair time, you won't, If one of my authors had sent a manuscript in 4 days before the London Book Fair, I would have known it was coming. I would have told them beforehand I won't be able to read it until after the fair and after the most time-conscious, urgent follow-up from the fair. And because the authors I represent are all real professionals, they would have known that. They would have been prepared to wait, or they would have spent another 2 weeks revising that manuscript to their own benefit and sent it in to me later. So there's quite a lot of reading, English understatement, involved in what we do. And you can't do it in the office. You do it in what is laughingly known as your spare time, of which there is none. I mean, I've got, 8 manuscripts in my iPad, in my editing app. So, I'm not going to be lost for things to do if this session was to finish early, for instance.
Off you go. Okay, another question.
Hello. I wonder if you've got any advice for someone who's read books, looked at the websites, done everything possible to get it all right, submitted to the right people and got good feedback on their writing, but it just hasn't been the right sort of book for those particular agents to take on at that time or whatever. Do you have advice on where next?
I think,
writing?
first of all, take great hope from that, because if you've got feedback, you will be in a very small percentile of people, because we don't have time to give feedback. I will only give feedback if there's something that's really good, but not quite there, or really good, but clearly outside the area that I represent. And if I have read it all, despite the fact that I know it's not something I would represent, it means because the writing really intrigued me. So I think you must be quite close to getting something good, because if you've got feedback from several parties, that really puts you ahead of most people. And perseverance, I'm afraid.
You've got to persevere, yes.
You know, some of the stories I could tell about books that have become major international bestsellers. A client of mine many, many, many years ago, the person I've represented longest in my agency career, she used to be able to make a living entirely out of short stories. Back in the Neanderthal days when there were 4 weekly magazines for women that took 2 short stories each and a serum. And she wrote the beginning of a very unusually structured novel. And there was the problem. It took me 4 years to sell it, 44 submissions, 43 rejections, 44 submissions. I got so bloody-minded by each rejection after that. I am going to sell this book. And in the end, I sold it for a tiny, tiny amount of money. And because it became one of those packages that every time an editor changed jobs, it would be on the desk waiting for me. And that book is Lady of Hay by Barbara Erskine. Now, it's sold 3 million copies in Britain. It's been in constant print for, I think it's now 27 or 29 years. It's published in 24 languages. That's my I told you so story. I've got the names of those 43 editors that turned it down.
And there are lots of tales like that.
There really are.
You know, you can spend. I spent a whole year when I wrote my first novel not getting an agent.
Even you, Jane.
And in those days, she was one of them.
We still speak.
In those days, you know, you sent it off in an envelope and you put in return a package, postage, and it thumped depressingly back on the mat, and the whole thing might have taken quite a long time. And I spent a whole year just sending it out, getting back, sending it back. And then, in fact, I sold mine directly myself, and it was bought by Transworld. It's, you know,
so, you know,
big publisher.
There is hope in stories like that. My author, Elizabeth Chadwick, who writes medieval historical fiction of just the greatest kind, I admire her so much. I took her on from the slush pile and discovered that the book I took on, which I sold 3 weeks later, we had an auction, it was her 8th manuscript. I said, what happened to numbers 1 to 7? Now, I mean, this woman has a work ethic that is beyond anybody I've ever known. She sent the first manuscript to one publisher. She got it rejected, and she thought, well, that must mean it's no good then. So I'll write another one. And she sent the second one to one agent, and that got rejected. So she had written 7 manuscripts that she'd only shown to one person each. But after I sold The Wild Hunt, which was her first book, and has been in print for 27 years, thank you very much, I read those first 7, and it was very obvious the order in which she'd written them, because each one got markedly better.
Yeah. Yes.
I hope you don't have to write 8 before you get published, but it is still possible, and actually that time that she spent on those 7 that didn't get published wasn't wasted.
No, I think that's the other thing. I mean, I think you have to balance perseverance with being realistic. And I mean, if you're getting negative feedback, you know, somebody gets in a manuscript and people keep saying this is too predictable, this is too linear, the ending's weak, then the ending probably is weak. So you may as well start again or rewrite it, or, you know, I think you have to sort of realise that also a lot of really top best-selling novelists around, if you ask them, they all wrote 2 or 3 books before.
It's very seldom that an author's published book is the first book they finish.
It wasn't me, but that was just because
You're clearly a genius.
No, it was just because I was a tenacious cow and I wouldn't give up. You know, I just kept going on and on. Actually, it would have probably done me good to have given up at that point, written another one, and
you got it published.
Yeah, I did, but you know, it's a lot of people, and I always think it's a bit mean. I say this as the intro to my book, was I always think it's a bit mean when people aren't honest about that, because I've seen authors you know, at a launch party talking about, oh yes, you know, I wrote this book and I was so lucky and I got so-and-so as my agent and now I've been in an auction and sold the film rights and oh, I'm so lucky. And I think, yeah, but that was your 4th book you'd written. And I always think it's mean not to say that because it makes everybody else feel inadequate. And I made myself a little sort of vow that when I did get published, I would always be honest about how long it took.
I agree.
And
Because
it took a long
Because
time.
talking about the real world as it is gives people hope.
Yeah. I finished that book in 1998 and I sold it in August 2000. So it took me all that time. So a lot of postage. Came to about 156 quid in postage.
You added it up?
No, I didn't. It must have been about that. And lots of weeping and wailing as well.
Those trips to the post office and queues.
Yes. Can I have another question? Yes, hand up there, young man.
Are you saying that when you're writing, a coincidence is always a bad thing?
Sorry, say that again. When you're writing?
When you're writing, are you saying that coincidence within your story is always a bad thing?
No. If coincidence is a bad thing, if it's the major plot point, that everything hinges on it, and it makes the reader think, oh, they're trying to get off lightly. But if you make us believe that events led up to it that couldn't become otherwise, then you've explained it and it's not just a coincidence on its own. But if you are writing a thriller, and it's meant to be thrilling, we don't want the answer to be so easy as, and then I tripped over the answer, you know, something like that. So if you are going to deliberately keep a coincidence in the plot, you've got to really work at the scenes that lead up to it so that the reader doesn't just think, ah, cheap shot, you know. So it's a risk if you do it, but if you can pull it off, that's great.
Another question. Anyone over this side of the room? I keep focusing right now. Okay, get it on. Yeah.
Hi, Carole. I have a question, which is it always best practice to absolutely finish the book before you ever send it out anywhere? Because we've heard a lot about how important it is to have a very strong premise for the book. And if you've finished it and spent 2 years writing it and the premise is wrong, you've wasted a lot of time. So would you only ever say, don't submit until you finish, or can you submit earlier on to get feedback about the premise?
You can do each, but some agents won't read things if they're not finished.
Right.
I've sold a lot of first books before they were finished, but the business has become tougher. It's become much more competitive. Anybody that's got an email address can send in a manuscript. If you've spent 2 years writing a book and somebody tells you after that the premise is no good, I think you should have done a bit more thinking about it during those 2 years. That's an easy, cheap shot for me to say, but certainly these days you get a better chance of somebody offering to represent you if it is finished. Because if you had never finished a manuscript before, and this is your first novel, and you send me in a few chapters, I could be left thinking, well, anybody can start a novel. Not as many people who start novels can finish them. Partly out of tenacity, partly because some people don't have the kind of work ethic, partly because it's easier to keep starting new ones because then you never get told that your novel is no good. But I think these days, when it is so very competitive, if you catch the eye of an agent and they say, I really like this, send me the rest, and you have to say, hang on a minute, I haven't written it, you might find that agent has, died, closed their list, been fired, the agency's been bought by somebody else before you finish it. To demonstrate the opposite to what I just said, my author Lawrence Norfolk, who writes very literary novels and certainly doesn't deliver a book a year, 12 years between his last 2 books, he approached me in all the ways that I would tell people not to. We were at a London Book Fair years ago when we used to have a stand on the publisher's floor, so anybody could come and talk to us. Now we're hidden behind the agent centre in that awful sort of call centre-like hall. And he was talking to an assistant. He was a tall young man, bald head, one earring, dressed entirely in black, a bit shifty. Gave a piece of paper to one of our assistants, and she put it in a drawer. And Julian, my partner in the agency, who had just finished a meeting, went up to her and said, what did he want? He looked a bit suspicious. And she said, oh, he's giving me a synopsis. And Julian took it out and looked at it. And thank God, noticed there was no address, no phone number. This was before emails. So he ran after him and just wrote the phone number down. how anybody could write a one-page synopsis for what afterwards became Longcrere's dictionary is beyond belief, except that Lawrence has a brain the size of a planet. But we ran after him, and so I said, can I see some chapters? He hadn't written anything. Now, I didn't find that out. He took him months to send. I did like it, and I sold it for a lot of money. Many years later, the book's published in Germany. It gets to the top of the bestseller list. I can just about read German if I work at it. And I was actually in Amsterdam on a business trip, and I was reading this big interview, whole-page interview in Süddeutsche Deutschland with Süddeutsche Zeitung with Lawrence. And I saw him saying, and somebody asked him, how did you get an agent? He said, I went to a book fair because my girlfriend said, stop just talking about writing a novel, go and do something. So I wrote a page synopsis in half an hour. And when she asked to see some chapters, I thought, I better write them. So I wrote and I said, do you know I'm mastered? You never told me. How did you find that? I didn't know you could be German. So, despite what I say, every piece of advice in publishing, you can do the opposite and still succeed if you're good enough, which, you know, might be a help to somebody, might just make other people want to tear their hair out. But, I mean, my overwhelming message would be, try to do what we ask for on the website, but if you can't do it specifically, and you know you can't write a good synopsis, but you think you're a good writer, go with your gut feeling and hope it works. Because I've got authors now who just can't write a synopsis to save their life, but they're professionally published authors, they don't have to. They get a contract, you know, based on thin air for the next book.
And I think we all, even those of us who have written lots of synopses, we all go, ooh, I've got to write a synopsis. I mean, they are a drag to write. But I mean, I think people get overstressed about them, because at the end of the day, all you really need to do is just write down in order what happens in your book.
Including the ending.
Yes. Do not say, by a marvellous twist of fate, what I wrote on my synopsis, by a marvellous twist of fate, it all comes right in the end. Yeah, that's how I wrote my
Yeah, I would say, although we say you break the rules, don't write that.
Don't. Trick with me is to do as I say, not do as I do.
I was wondering, Carole, could mention about
so I didn't hear the beginning, that's
I wondered if you could mention about the time it takes roughly from when you accept an author to their book being published.
Well, if I can't sell it, you know, forever.
Say it's
if I take something on, it's not a guarantee it will be published. I'd like to say that it would be a guarantee it would be published, and there are very few books I've given up on, very few authors I've given up on, because I am very bloody-minded. But with Barbara Erskine, it took 4 years before it was even accepted. But once a book is accepted, usually, if you have finished it, it will usually be published within a year. If you've written a very timely book on current events, it can be fast-tracked and it can be published faster than that. If you are writing a book that the publisher wants to be a lead title, and they want to have a space in their schedule so they can give a tremendous amount of attention to it, it could take longer than that because they want to wait until their schedule has the right kind of gap. There's no real rule, but it's about a year after the book gets accepted, if it's finished.
May I just follow on from that, ask you, when you're reading the script, do you think about international sales at the same time as the UK sales?
Always, yeah.
I mean, I live in Germany, and I'm writing my first novel, and I am thinking about the reader quite often, and the business side of it, and who's going to buy it and who's going to sell it, and I think it's
you can trip yourself up a bit with overthinking.
Yeah.
But I think once you've got an agent, that agent will hopefully know the international places that that kind of novel would fit. I mean, I've always said, don't think that you've got to put sort of 8 locations in a book to make it international. All that does is to mean we're going to spend a lot of time reading about airports. You can set a novel on a Norwegian field, and as long as the characters are interesting, the action is interesting, emotions are international. Human nature doesn't change that much. So you can have a novel set in a very tiny, tight location in one spot, and it will work internationally. because people want to read about people. And I do think that the characters in the book are more important than the plot, because the characters will make the plot happen. If you start with a tight plot and you make your characters twist and turn their personalities to fit where you want them to go, you're going to have a book that doesn't work. That wasn't a question, it was just thought came to me.
Yeah, I think I would just like to add, I think it's a big mistake to sort of spend too much time when you're writing a book thinking about, you know, will this be commercial, will this be marketable, will it sell in Germany or whatever. I mean, obviously you need to have, they do need to be commercial and marketable, but if you sit down intending to write the next big thing rather than the book that you feel passionately about, I think it tends to not work and it tends to show. And anyway, by the time you've finished it, the next big thing will have changed and it'll be another big thing.
Yeah, I mean, if you try to please too many people and try to make your plot, you know, I've got to have something that's going to appeal to Germany, I've got to have something that's going to appeal to Italy, you'll end up with something that probably doesn't appeal to anybody at all.
So just write the book that you feel passionate about, because quite frankly, it's hard enough to write a book anyway. If you're just trying to do it to fit in with some sort of parameters, it's going to be almost impossible. And if it's, you know, if the writing's good enough, and as Carole says, the characters are engaging enough, it will sell anyway.
I mean, if you think about the Chadwick novels, which were all about very English medieval history, you know, she's a bestseller in Germany because the characters she writes about are interesting enough. And even if people, she's a New York Times bestseller, so, you know, the Americans do not get taught a lot of English medieval history, believe me. But people will read her book and they will learn from it, but they're reading it because they want to live vicariously through his characters. 5 minutes left.
Right. Is there anybody else who wants to ask? Yes, I know. It's just because you asked one already. I just wondered if there was anybody else. But no, if there isn't, do you know?
Okay,
Sorry, yes, go on.
Are you more interested in somebody who's going to write more than one book? And so are you quite interested when one submits to you to know that there is other books in...
Yes, the question was, do we always want to know that someone's going to write another book? Yes. I represent career writers. I don't represent people who've just written one book and are going to go off into the sunset and paint pictures for the rest of their lives. The amount of work necessary to sell the first book has to be paid for by being amortised over more than one book. I mean, very often, if you're writing fiction and the publisher wants to publish it, they will offer you a 2-book contract because they want some continuity. The amount of money you have to spend to publish that first book is usually out of all proportion to what you expect to get back by way of profit on that first one. But you hope, the publisher hopes, or I hope the publisher hopes, that they are building a platform for that author that's going to pay off on the next book and the next book.
So would you, when making the first submission of your first novel, would you also be interested in hearing about another novel?
I'd be interested in you saying in the submission letter, and I am planning another novel, or I have started my second novel. You could even then give a paragraph about it, but don't send in more than one manuscript at the same time. Particularly, don't move from one genre to another with each book, because then there's no way for the publisher or the agent to build a platform for you with the first book that is going to bring those readers to the second book. Now, writers will often say, but I feel too boxed in, I don't want to go on writing the same kind of book. I'm afraid publishing these days requires you to not write the same book, but write a book for the same audience. Until you get to be, you know, Dan Brown or Ken Follett, you do what you like and the readers will follow you. But that takes quite a few best-selling books to achieve.
Does anybody else wish to ask anything? We're nearly at the end of the time anyway. We can have one more. Yes, gentlemen.
Is there an after you turn around and then they've become successful?
Of course. I mean, yeah. Despite the fact that I like to think I was totally and utterly infallible, evidence shows that not to be so. Yes, and it's right in a way, because if I don't see the possibility, here I am excusing myself obviously, but I do think this is the truth. If I don't see the possibility in that manuscript that somebody else sees, then I'm not the right person to take it on. You need, as a writer, you need somebody who immediately sees what they can do with it. It's got to be a mixture of emotion and business. You know, we all use the phrases, I love that. in my case, if I love something and I offer to represent it, I love it and I believe in it, but up here I'm thinking, and I know I can sell it. So it's got to be that mixture. And if I was to read something like Between the Oceans, I turn that down. It's a major bestseller, about 20 markets, that really peeves me. But it doesn't in a way, because I read that synopsis and it just didn't grab me. And I have to say I've read the book since and it doesn't grab me. So I am not the right person to have sold that. I wouldn't have achieved for her what her agent achieved for her. It's got to be, it's a bit like dating, you know, you can't explain why you don't fancy that bloke, but you really fancy that bloke. That's perhaps too much information.
So if we could then, Carole, if you had to give one nugget of wisdom that everybody in the room would really love to be published, to take away with,
I would say, given how easy it is to find out information about what's going on in the book business, do a lot of homework. There's nothing more guaranteed to get a fast rejection, even if your material is good. If you start off by enraging the agent, by waving a flag and going, I haven't done any homework, I haven't looked at your manuscript, have my children's book. Fuck off, sorry. If this is the middle of a Sunday afternoon for some people is a day off, and I'm reading screeds and screeds and screeds of submissions, it is really silly to come upon something that is manifestly not what I would take on. And you just think, this, and you know, I don't do them every week, and sometimes it can take a couple of months for an answer. And then I get a rude letter back saying, it's a genre you don't represent, it took you 2 months to find out. Yes, because I can't read them the day they come in.
Absolutely. And my top tip? Marry somebody rich.